Welcome to the Treasury Update podcast presented by Strategic Treasurer, your source for interesting Treasury news, analysis, and insights in your car, at the gym, or wherever you decide to tune in. On this episode of the podcast, Jeffery continues the Learning from Literature subseries featuring J.M. Barrie's Peter Pan. This illustration expands upon the quote, "It is not in doing what you like, but in liking what you do that is the secret of happiness." Listen in to learn some helpful tools, perspective, and advice on how to enjoy your career journey in Treasury. Welcome back to the podcast, Craig.
Thank you, Meredith. It's good to be here again.
Today we're going to continue our Learning from Literature series, and I'm looking forward to learning more about what book and character you have in store for us today.
The book is Peter Pan. It's by James Matthew Barrie.
Peter Pan is a classic and a family favorite. Did you read it to your kids?
I suppose I should be embarrassed that I didn't read it to the kids, but we used audiobooks on trips. And so Peter Pan is one of the ones that we used to listen and talk about. We also followed that up with Peter and the Starcatcher series of books. I can't remember if there's 5 or 6 in that series. That's by Dave Barrie and Ridley Pearson. So I guess it's sort of like reading if you have someone read it on an audiobook.
Give us a quick summary of the story.
I'm expecting most of the North American and probably some of the Western European listeners are familiar with the story. But Peter Pan, the book is sometimes called something different. I think it's Peter and Wendy, or the boy who would never grow up or wouldn't grow up. And it's this tale is weaved together of this energetic, mischievous, free-spirited boy who can fly. Of course, that's the cool part. And his adventures on this island called Neverland. And he visits John, Michael, and Wendy. Their last name is Darling, so that's the family that he visits. And he unfortunately or fortunately loses his shadow in their house. And Wendy is able to sew his shadow back onto him. And in a different way, he teaches them to fly and convinces Wendy, John, and Michael to come to Neverland with him. And they have an amazing set of adventures. And if you haven't read the story, I'm not going to spoil it for our listeners.
Oh, I love Peter Pan. Although this story is filled with pixie dust, Peter Pan does offer some real-life lessons. What's today's illustration?
Yeah, I like Peter Pan. It's not one of my top 10 children's books, for example, but it's good. But the one of the quotes that's made an impact to me, and I don't remember reading it during the book, but the quote is, "It is not in doing what you like, but in liking what you do that is the secret of happiness." So it's not in doing what you like, but in liking what you do. And so that flip of words gets us thinking about some really interesting things that brings the children's book to life, for business or even for adults.
That's a great quote. What is the secret of happiness? I know everyone's looking for that, right?
This is Learning from Literature series, not the Secret of Happiness podcast. But no, I mean, thanks for that question. But to be clear, I think the quote there is, it's helpful advice, and taken to the right measure. It can lead to satisfaction and proper views on being satisfied in the work we do. And, to some measure, it helps with the contentment in our jobs and activities. And like I was saying, the secret of happiness may be a bit of a reach, but there is definitely some wisdom in this. I think that's something we can talk about, and that I was hoping to discuss.
Where do you find satisfaction in what you like and liking what you do?
Yeah, I always thought of this example. You want to do what you're good at, that you're skilled at, where you add value and you find pleasure in doing it. And the more of that you can do, the better. But there's always going to be tasks that you may not like. You might be in a journey where you're doing things that are not particularly fun. And I think of it as, part of it is perspective. Part of it might be what you do, but part of it can be perspective. And I'll use a more earthy example, maybe not earthy example, but a home building example. Are you building a house, or are you pounding in nails or pounding nails into wood? Are you thinking of it as the broader picture, or something very small? Like, I'm using a piece of wood and steel to hammer another piece of steel into wood. I do that over and over again. I do this all day long. Or are you providing, a shelter for a family or for an individual? And I guess the idea is two of that is, whatever you're doing, do you understand where it fits into the broader picture and the broader scope? And does that give you a sense of satisfaction and accomplishment?
How can we apply this to treasury and or the career of treasurers?
If you are a people watcher or a people hearer, and you listen to how people describe their jobs and activities, this can provide a pretty good indication of, are they taking a small view or a large view? If a cash manager is, described, I download reports and read key information into spreadsheets. I run the same reports every day. I email them out. I review the numbers to see if things are what was expected. If all this is described in a boring and mechanistic way or manner, that's a thinking small. Versus, I'm responsible to make sure our short-term liquidity or cash, will meet our needs each day. Part of what I do protects against fraud. Part of this makes sure we optimize our most liquid asset for borrowing, for investing. And I have to make sure I bring everyone up to speed on how their actions impact our cash, and find ways to be more effective and perform these duties more efficiently. And when you hear that described, they're thinking large. They're thinking, what am I doing, and how does it help the overall organization? And they're thinking of how they can improve it for more joy, if you will, but for more efficiency, and maybe to do other important activities. So I think listening to how people describe things gives you a clue on what they're thinking, but that's also reflective. How are you thinking about your jobs and your tasks? And, I have some number of treasury friends who say, do whatever you're asked, so that you can, be quick to say yes, so you can learn more tasks and jobs. And that's one aspect of thinking broadly and liking what you do, as opposed to say, I only want to do what I like. Sometimes being more of a volunteer allows you to eventually do more of what you like, because you'll like more of what you do. You'll have better experiences. You'll provide better value to the organization. So that's one way I think we can apply it to treasury and to our careers.
What kind of tools, perspective, or advice can you offer treasurers who may feel stuck in a project or perhaps their careers?
I think part of that is, there's always going to be things that you have to do that you may not enjoy or love. Know what you like to do, what gives you great excitement and encouragement. Just think about that. What have you done personally and professionally that you're most proud of, that you can talk about, while other people around you are like, who may not be connected with it, are sort of like, okay, I've heard enough, I don't get it. But you're engaged in that. So when you think about that, understand that about yourself, and also what can help your organization and your team most effectively, and where can you have the biggest impact. I think when those things are combined, that self-reflection is probably the best part. I don't necessarily have a tool for that, but that would be the advice part.
Maybe you can move into some concrete examples of persevering, focusing, and being satisfied with where you're at until you get to where you're going.
I like and dislike that question. It conflicts me a bit. And you did share that question ahead of time, so I don't want to pretend it just caught me by surprise. But I've had a hard time thinking about that. And part of it is, stick-to-itiveness or perseverance is crucial for so much success. Being able to stick to something and see it through is vital. That's part of being, faithful and consistent. At the same time, sometimes failing quickly and recognizing that something's failing quickly is useful too. So there's a calibration on that. Another factor that conflicts me is we learn from people who are lazy, quote, lazy, about efficiency. They don't want to do anything more than necessary. And you can look down and say, hey, they're lazy. But they're trying to reduce the amount of work to get something done. And sometimes they're extraordinarily creative, mainly because they're avoiding work. And we can look down on that, or we can also learn from it and say, they have a mind for efficiency. Overall, Meredith, I think it's great to have goals and know where you want to get. Where you want to get to. But when you fixate on that goal, too much of life becomes dead space, waiting until you get to where you think there is. We only think about the destination. So thinking less about the destination as a point and more about the journey towards, whatever you're doing is helpful. So you're not just focused on one point, but also the journey. And, one of the things that's helped me. Sue, my wife, is quite good on this. I'm much more, I want to get to where I'm going if we're driving the car. And she always likes, books on tape and trips, and does, we don't just flat out drive 500 miles or 600 miles in a day. There'll be side trips, things to see, and there'll be books. And so we'll listen to books like Peter and the Starcatcher on the journey and be able to talk about that. So it's not just let's put the distance in as quickly as possible because the journey is terrible and it's only about the destination. It's about both. It's also about the journey. And I'll give you an example because you did ask for a concrete example. And I'm afraid this is kind of a boring example. It's about contracts and agreements. So I think we'll lose all of our listeners on this one. But early in my career, I'd have to review some contracts and agreements with banks, whether it was, credit related or service related. And I put them off. I delayed it. I didn't hate it. I dreaded it. And so I put it off all the time. And that was rather immature. And, what I found I had to do was I had to force myself to work on them and to get through them. And while I don't love contracts and agreements now, I don't mind them as much. I see them as part of the path to relationships, activity, projects, business. And, I was thinking about this. I think I review close to 200 agreements a year now. It might be more than that, but there's everything from NDAs to master services agreements to statement of works all the time. And to me, that would have been death before. So I know it doesn't tie into the, Barrie quote about, what did he say? It's the secret of happiness. I wouldn't say contract review is happiness, but liking what you do and taking that big picture has made a significant difference for me in terms of some of the things that I have to do.
So it's about kind of like enjoying the journey.
It really is. And maybe I'm not sure that's a better quote than what Barrie said, but he brings up a really good point, and just the way he says it makes you think about it. But you're right. It's part of that is the journey. Part of that's the big picture and not getting stuck. Not getting mentally stuck is important.
Can you repeat the quote again?
Sure. It is not in doing what you like, but in liking what you do that is the secret of happiness.
So any final thoughts or recommendations for those on their way to becoming a treasurer?
Yeah, and I think it's probably more broadly applicable than just that, but it certainly is for those that want to become a treasurer or on their way to becoming a treasurer, because there's a lot of time that you have to commit to things. So, first I'd say enjoy what you're doing, make plans, but have the big picture in mind. Focusing on the future to the exclusion of the present is a way of wishing your career away, wishing your life away. And there's certainly no delight in that. And that doesn't end well. it doesn't end not only in happiness, but I think in your well-being. And finally, recognize the journey and enjoy the journey. That doesn't mean give up on any dreams that you may have, but certainly recognize the journey, enjoy it. That's really good advice for any financial professional, but certainly those on their way to becoming a treasurer.
Craig, that's excellent advice. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Well, thank you, Meredith.
And thanks to our listeners around the globe for tuning in. Have a great weekend.
You've reached the end of another episode of the Treasury Update podcast. Be sure to follow Strategic Treasurer on LinkedIn. Just search for Strategic Treasurer. This podcast is provided for informational purposes only, and statements made by Strategic Treasurer LLC on this podcast are not intended as legal, business, consulting, or tax advice. For more information, visit and bookmark strategictreasurer.com.